percentage of English language learners, our percentage of students that qualify for special education services, as well as our foster youth and our students without permanent housing. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see roughly the number of employees that we have in Fremont Unified School District, 3,700. And you'll note that 60% of those are teachers, and when we say teachers, we're encompassing teachers, counselors, speech and language therapists, school psychologists. 36% of our staff are support staff, that's generally our classified staff, and 4% of our district staff are managers. When we take a look at Fremont Unified School District as a whole, we're very proud to be the 23rd largest school district in the state. We have 44 schools and programs throughout the district. You'll notice we have 29 elementary schools, 5 middle schools, 5 comprehensive high schools, 1 continuation school, 1 alternative school, our adult school, and we have 2 early learning centers. Also very proud of the fact that we have a Spanish dual immersion program, a Mandarin immersion program, an elementary science magnet school, and an arts magnet high school in Fremont Unified. You'll note in the middle of the screen some of the honors that have recently been awarded to our schools. In 2023, we had 6 different elementary schools recognized as distinguished schools for the state of California. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Distinguished Schools program, that changes every year from elementary to secondary. And so it's common that we'll have those groups recognized in corresponding years. You'll note in 2021, John F. Kennedy was identified as a distinguished school, and also Robertson High School is noted as a model continuation school for the state of California. It also happens to be the only continuation high school in the nation that has the recognition of being a professional learning community school. So really proud of the work that's happening at Robertson and Vista. So when we talk about the numbers and why does school funding matter, what we're really talking about is our students, our staff, and our community. And I think it's important to look at the funding model for the state, which we'll go into in a little bit more information shortly. But in the overarching scheme of things, we're talking about a funding model where the state allocates a specific dollar amount per student for a school district. And it's intended through what they call the local control funding formula to create equity across school districts in the state. I think we'll demonstrate tonight that the intentions are good, but that the results create some inequities as well. And why that is important is because as a public school district, we're not like a private sector business, where when the economy changes, we can change the price of our product, or we can change the cost of delivering the product that we deliver for education. What we're really looking at is the state providing us funding, and we are left to deal with what happens at the state level economy. And so a term that you often hear in school funding or in funding outside of schools is COLA, and that's the cost of living adjustment. And I think in general terms, we look at the COLA as how much we pay for goods and services as individuals or as companies or as an agency or as a school district. And we think about that COLA being something where we're going to receive an adjustment in funding each year because goods and services are increasing in costs. What is unique about the state funding model under the local control funding formula is that the amount of money that we receive per student goes up by the COLA. And that increase in revenue is the only source of state ongoing increased revenue that the school district receives. And so that creates a little bit of a push and pull or a tension with how we deal with the increased revenue, which needs to be used for unfunded or underfunded mandates, which we'll talk about tonight. It also needs to be used for the increase in costs for goods and services that the school district purchases as an agency. And as we know, the COLA is a critical part of trying to make sure we're doing everything we can to honor the hard work of all of our employees and recruit and retain employees. And we recognize that a significant portion of that decision-making process for employees comes down to salary and salary increases. And so you can start to see the push and pull and the tension that exists within any public school district that's funded under the LCFF in how they honor the great work that's happening by the employees in place where we are a people business, yet dealing with underfunded and unfunded mandates while also having increased costs. And so we'll start to go through those in detail tonight. One of the areas that we'll be looking at is the framework of focus, which is a draft document that we're building in Fremont Unified School District. And it really contains 3 pillars: teaching and learning, which is the core of what we do, and safe, supportive schools, because we know that good teaching and learning won't be happening if we don't have a physically and emotionally safe environment for all students and all staff. And the 3rd pillar there is sound fiscal management. And I won't read them all to you, but you can see the goals and intentions that we are looking at for sound fiscal management within Fremont Unified School District. We have a very limited set of resources, and we want to make sure that we're allocating the fiscal resources and the fiscal capital, as well as the human capital, in line with the goals and objectives we want to accomplish as a district. And so as we look at the funding model, we're going to invite our Associate Superintendent, Mr. Daniel Hillman, up to the stage, and he's going to review some of the mechanics for school funding, and then I'll return in a few minutes and talk about some of the challenges that exist related to what we then do with that funding and how we address the needs of our students, our staff, and our community. Mr. Hillman?
Thank you, Superintendent Kamick. So, as our superintendent was just discussing, we do get a lot of our dollars from the state government. And so we're going to start by just kind of looking at a general overview. There's more than 1,000 school districts, public school districts in the state of California, and the majority of them get the largest size of their revenue from the state of California. And that comes through the local patrol funding formula, something we'll get into more in a second. And then also additional state funds that are made available to schools for various programs and various reasons. So typically you can look at a school site budget of any district in the state of California, and you're going to see that about 75 to 90%, depending upon the district, of their funds come from the state, one way or another. The federal government is really not involved that much, unfortunately. There's an opportunity, we'll talk more about something that they could do for us, but about approximately 5% of Fremont Unified's revenues come from the federal government. And I think that until you start getting into this topic, the general public thinks that more comes from the federal government, and that's actually not the case. Local funding, this does fluctuate from school district to school district, but it makes up a pretty small share of Fremont Unified's revenues, even after taking into consideration the local parcel tax that the community voted in and approved a few years ago, and local school site donations. So that can vary from district to district. It's not going to come anywhere close to the state size, but it can be bigger in certain communities. In Fremont, it's also fairly small, similar in size to the federal size of the pie. So a little bit of an overview, and then we're going to dive into each one of these things in a little bit more detail. The allocation of money to schools in California is incredibly complicated, and it's complicated because it's an evolving thing. It started out up until the 1970s as really a local issue, and there were lots of court cases, and there was lots of propositions and ballot initiatives that kept the funding and all the decision making at the local level. That was working fine for the most part, and then some inequities started to be identified. So back before the 1970s, local property taxes were the primary driver of school funding in the state of California. And that worked for some communities, and it didn't work so well for other communities. And it was ruled unconstitutional, which is true. It's not fair. It doesn't match the state's constitution that all students will receive an appropriate education. And then coupled with that, in 1978, Proposition 13 was passed. And Proposition 13 basically put a cap on the amount of property tax that's assessed. And so that basically took the local funding away from schools. So the state had to step in. And so what ended up happening is they worked on a new formula, and then they kept messing with the formula over several years to try to make it consistent and to try to make it fair. And in 1988, Proposition 98 was voted in, and basically what it did is it set up a formula that allocated approximately 40% every year of the state's general fund budget for education. And it created something called the minimum guarantee. And so that minimum guarantee was schools, you can identify this amount of money every single year It'll be spread out to districts in different ways, but the share of the state's budget will be set by this formula, and it's in the state's constitution, and that's what Prop 98 does. It worked. It wasn't perfect, but it worked for a little while. It was better than what we had in the 70s. And then there was another tweak that came in 2013, and that's the local control funding formula. You've heard us talk about that. The local control funding formula improved and did some different things. We'll get into those in just a second. But it's all based upon student enrollment and attendance rates. Student enrollment, the number of students that we have enrolled in our district, and then how many of those students attend on a daily basis matters very, very much to the types of funds and the amount of funds that school districts get. Local property taxes are still involved. We're going to show you how that works in just a second. They're still collected by counties, and they're still distributed to schools. They're like the first line of defense as a part of Prop 98, and then the state provides funds on top of that. And the state collects other taxes to try to basically fill in the gaps that local property taxes won't cover. So let's talk about the state tax revenues. There are three main drivers of the California State General Fund, and that is personal income tax, sales tax, and corporate tax or corporation tax. Those three things alone make up 95% of the state's general fund. And you can look at the numbers there on the right-hand side of the screen. Personal income tax in the current year is projected to be $126 billion or more. It accounts for 75, or it did account, pardon me, for 75% of the state revenues in 22-23. So by and large, the majority of the state's general fund is coming from personal income tax. We are a personal income tax-driven state. That's how we get our revenues. Other states do it differently, but this is how California does it. Also, we'd like to point out that 1% of Californians contribute 50% of all personal income tax collected. That is a staggering number and statistic to think about, because if the stock market changes and capital gains taxes change for the people that like to invest, there goes the fortune of the state's general fund. So the state's general fund is very much tied to the ebb and flow of investment markets, and that's one of the reasons we have to watch that very closely. Sales tax is another big driver. It's not as big as personal income, but it's still big. We like $39 billion, that's good. And so when people buy stuff, the state collects more tax. And then obviously we have corporation tax, corporate tax, that's bringing in a similar amount to sales tax. The projections are very similar for the 23-24 year. So what Proposition 98 essentially does, as we mentioned, is it takes these three taxes, guarantees a minimum level of funding for public schools, and the idea is that it's keeping pace with the growth of K-12 student population and the personal income of California residents. So I'm not going to get into the super weeds on this, but if you're super interested, you can check it out, and there's three tests that the legislature and the legislative analyst's office look at every year. And they look at the data and they look at the statistics. And one of the key things is the student population growing, shrinking? It's never flat, so it's either growing or shrinking. Those are the two options. And then they're also looking at the personal income of California residents. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? And what Prop 98 has essentially done is given lots of flexibility to the legislature and the governor to be able to set that minimum funding level if revenues come in less than their projections. So if, from the previous slide, if all of those projections are wrong and they don't collect enough tax, the legislature and the governor can set the funding level within Prop 98 by choosing one of the other tests if they want to. They can also, with a 2/3 vote in the legislature, say they're not going to follow Prop 98. And they can do that, and they've done that most recently in the Great Recession. They can also provide more than the minimum guarantee, which they did in a way, not through Prop 98, but they did an add-on to LCFF a couple of years ago because there was extra money in the revenue, so they wanted to give it to schools. So it took the base of what schools were getting and bumped it up a little bit, beyond the COLA, which is what Superintendent Campbell was talking about. It was beyond a cost of living adjustment. So that was great, that was wonderful. That was what we would hope to see any year the state has a surplus. That was the first time they had done that since LCFF was adopted in 2013. So we went almost a decade before we saw anything other than minimum funding. And as we mentioned earlier, about 40% of the state's general fund is allocated to K-14 education. The 14 is a community college. So this visual is probably one of the best visuals I think we've found to explain how property taxes and state taxes complement one another. So a district like Fremont Unified, as we mentioned, is funded under LCFF. So first what happens is the local property taxes are collected and poured into the jar. That's basically where the first set of revenues come from, collected by the county, distributed to school districts. From there, if the minimum guarantee, the LCFF funding level on the right-hand side, is higher than the property taxes, the state says, okay, we're going to fill up the rest of the bucket for you. And in Fremont Unified, that's exactly what happened last year. It happens every year at Fremont. In 22-23, 49%, or $182 million of our funding level came from local property taxes. So property taxes are still important. We still need them. The state fills in the rest, about $187 million last year. So what happens if your district is in a community where the property taxes overflow the bucket? Well, if that happens, it looks like this. And the local district gets to keep the extra money. And the state doesn't have to contribute anything for LCFF. So one of the most, I would say, well-known community-funded districts is what this is called. Nearby would be Palo Alto Unified. Their property taxes are very high. It's a beautiful community, and they collect those taxes, and it more than funds the funding level that's set by the state for the local district. And so if they collect more, the district gets to keep it and invest it right back in their schools and in their staff. So local control funding formula, we want to break this down for you. It is truly a formula. It's not a super complicated one, and we want to break it down so you guys can all understand it too. Two key drivers of the formula. One is something called base grants, and the other is a supplemental and concentration grants. So base grant, that is essentially average daily attendance. Those are the kids that we have showing up every day. We're going to show you the numbers that we get for each of the grade spans in just a second. And that sets the base. And that's the base for every district in the state. It doesn't matter where the kids are coming from. Doesn't matter what county you're in. Northern California, Southern California, doesn't matter. Same number. If you have a kindergartner, you're getting the same cash as anybody else in the state. The difference comes in with this other two types of grants, a supplemental grant and a concentration grant. And the way that this grant is allocated is based off of a percentage called the unduplicated pupil percentage. And essentially, it's the number of students that we have enrolled in the district who are either English learners, eligible for the free and reduced meal program, or they're foster youth. The reason it's called unduplicated is because we only count that student once. Meaning, if the student is an English learner and also a foster youth, we don't get to count them twice, we count them once. That's why they came up with the term unduplicated. We call it UPP because it's hard to spit all that out all at once, but UPP looks a little bit like this. So the bottom green bar, these are the dollar amounts we get in 23-24, the current school year. For every TK to 3 student, it's about $10,951 per student. If that student is an unduplicated student, so either foster youth, English language learner, or someone who qualifies for free and reduced lunch on the federal program scale, we get an additional $2,100 for that student. You can see how it goes up with the grade spans. Grades 4 through 6 is 10,000 as a base. You add on 2,000, etc., etc. The top bar, 65% concentration grant. The $7,100 is 65% of the base. And districts get that top bar, the blue one, if they have more than 55% of their students qualified as UPP. In Fremont Unified, we don't have any students. We don't have that many students. So we don't get the blue bar of funding. We get the base, and we get the yellow bar. So this is what it looks like in real time. This is the actual numbers for Fremont Unified in 23-24. We're anticipating that we're going to get $361 million total. You can see our base is $342 million, supplemental of $19 million. We've compared this to a district that will remain nameless, but it's a real district, and they're about 30,000 students just like us. But their UPP, their unduplicated count, is 78%. So their needs are higher. So they're getting more money. Their supplemental grant is over $50 million, and then their concentration grant is another $50 million. So you have two districts with similar sized enrollments getting very different levels of funding because LCFF is trying to account for the fact that higher need students need more money. And this is the way LCFF was built. So we can have a conversation about whether it's fair or whether it's right, but this is the new formula that's been in place. I say new, it's been a decade now, but this is the new formula. and this is how it works, and this is how you can calculate it. By comparison, Fremont Unified, we're about 28% of our students are unduplicated, so they're either qualifying in one of those three categories. So what does LCFF pay for? LCFF pays for core components of our district operations. It includes, but is not limited to, classroom teachers, clerical and administrative support, custodial, maintenance, and other operational supports. It also pays for things like related supplies and services, and generally funded by the base. Supplemental funds, as we talked about with the grants just a second ago, these funds are key to the local control and accountability plan called the LCAP. It's something that every district has to have. It has to be voted on and has to have community input. And these costs are related to personnel, services, materials, and operations above and beyond our base level, or above and beyond our core level services. LCFF does not pay for special education. We get a different state grant for that, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. It doesn't cover all the costs. And we also don't get any specific facility funding at all from LCFF. So that's something that most districts rely upon local support to do, and Fremont has been successful with that in the past with the passage of Measure E, our general obligation bond. Sometimes the state will put a statewide bond for facilities on the ballot for voters to choose, but that's going to be distributed among all school districts in the state, and that's not going to be enough, obviously, for those needs, let alone a single district. So facilities funding doesn't come out of LCFF either. So one of the things that I wanted to be able to review tonight is basically how we account for some of the financial activities. And I promise I won't go super in the weeds on this, but there's a couple things we wanted you to be able to pull away from this presentation tonight. And one of them is how we track our revenues and expenditures in funds. We have 14 different funds that we have set up in the district. And we have to follow the same accounting rules as every school district in the state. We don't get to make up our accounting rules. So the nomenclature, the numbering, the naming, it's all set by education code and something called the standardized accounting system, which I won't bother you with. But basically, funds is the important part because we have different monies in different funds for different purposes. So here's the list of funds. There's a lot on this slide. You don't have to memorize it. CJ wanted to give you guys a test later, but we won't do that. So Fund 1 is the general fund, and I want to point this one out. It's italicized on purpose. This is the main operating fund for the district. The majority of our transactions go through the general fund, Fund 1. And that's when we are talking about reserves or expenditures. It's primarily Fund 1 is what we're discussing. Two other ones that are on here that are italicized, Fund 17. It's a special reserve. And we'll talk more about our reserves in a second, but we have set up our reserves to sit in Fund 17, separate from everything else, so that they remain untouched, and it's very clear what they're for. It's state law that we hold on to reserves, and we'll talk about that in a sec. And then Fund 21 is our building fund, and this is the location where we house all of the monies for Measure E, the general obligation bond, and also any of the expenditures that we do. They come from there. So they're held completely separate from the general fund, from Fund 1. None of the funds get intermixed, everything is separate. You can also tell by some of these titles that there are very specific functions that occur within these funds, like Fund 13, cafeteria, for instance. All the cafeteria stuff, all child nutrition services lives in that fund. Think of these almost like accounts, but they don't use the term account, they use the term fund. So, general fund, let's talk a little bit more about that. The general fund for this year is a projection of $482 million. And the general fund, like every fund, has two sides to it. An unrestricted and a restricted. So on the unrestricted side, we have $404 million. 389 of that is LCFF. We just talked about that, and I showed you guys the stacked bar graph. And then we also have additional monies that are on the unrestricted side. $16.6 million. Some of that's local parcel tax, $4.5 million. That's local funding. And then the state gives us some lottery funding as well. There's about 5.3 we're expecting this year from lottery funds. And we can use that on anything we want because it sits on the unrestricted side of the budget. On the restricted side of the budget, we have about $78 million. And this is where the majority of our federal dollars live. It's also, you can see here, we get about $6.4 million from the federal government for special education, $2.5 million for Titles 1, 2, 3, and then CTE is career technical education. The state gives us an additional $64 million, 27 specifically for special education, $2 million for lottery, And then in the last 2 years, they've given us $34 million in block grants as a one-time block grant to pay for various things as we've transitioned out of COVID. It's not a mistake that you see lottery on both sides, unrestricted and restricted. It's because the state gives us some lottery funds that have a very specific purpose and we have to spend it on that, so they're restricted. And some funds are unrestricted, we can spend them on whatever the district likes. Also, any local donations that come into school sites are on the restricted side because it's tied to a particular staff member, it's been given to that staff member or to that school site, and so that lives on our restricted side of the budget. As I mentioned, every single fund has an unrestricted and restricted, so if you go into Fund 21, you might find some restricted funds there, or Fund 40, that's very common, because sometimes we get dollars from different locations, and we have to make sure we account for them separately, so that we can prove to the state and our auditor that we're following the rules appropriately. That's why we separate them into unrestricted and restricted. So, same information, just in a pie graph, so you can kind of tell. We talked about the revenues at the top of the presentation. Here it's broken down a little differently. LCFF, almost $390 million we're expecting this year. Federal revenues, 9.6. State revenues, other than LCFF, 73 million. And then local revenues and any transfers into general fund, 9.7. So our total revenue that we're projecting for the general fund, about 482 million. And then here's the expenditure side. And you can see that the lion's share is this, the group called certificated salaries. So a certificated salary in education means anybody that's a credential holder. So you're talking about counselors, teachers, it could be your certificated administrators, your principals, your assistant principals. Those are people that are certificated. They're holding a credential, a teaching credential or administrative credential. Classified salaries account for all the employees who are non-credentialed. So you're talking about bus drivers, people, child nutrition workers, our office secretaries, people who don't typically have a credential to do their job are in the classified section. Employee benefits, 103 million there. And I want to highlight something because it says benefits, and you may remember a couple minutes ago I said we don't get to pick these titles. These are told to us by the state. So what's included in employee benefits in Fremont, if you work in Fremont, you're saying, wait, we don't get health benefits in Fremont. We have to pay for those on our own. Yes, that's true. That's something that the employee groups over the years, starting in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, voted on during their negotiations to put the value of their benefits onto the salary schedule rather than have the district contribute to the purchase of benefits. That was a decision made a long time ago. So what's this 103 million for? Well, this is the state required fees, essentially, like unemployment insurance and things like that that come out of everyone's paycheck. This is the expense that we have to pay as a district to the state for that. And the other big chunk that's in here is the employer contributions to pensions, which we're going to have a whole slide on pensions because we want to talk about that with you too. So all told, if you add up certificated, classified salaries along with employee benefits, I think we're at something like 85% of our overall budget in the general fund. It goes to people. It goes to our employees. And that's a good thing because we want our employees to be well compensated. We also want to attract new employees to come when we have vacancies. As Mr. Kamek mentioned, we are a people business. We work with people and we work for students. So we don't produce widgets and we don't produce other things. We produce knowledge and people. And so us investing in our people is the best investment with the funds that we have. But when tough economic times come, you can see that there's not a lot of other places to go if you need to cut funding for things. If the state cuts funding to us, where do we look first to cut our expenditures down to match? If you look at books and supplies and services and other transfers, there's not as much money there. And so unfortunately what happens with the ebb and flow of the economic cycle and funding for schools is you'll often have people saying, don't cut my job, do this instead. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of wiggle room with any school district. This isn't something unique to Fremont. It's just the way the system is set up in the state of California. And it's unfortunate and it's not great, but it is our reality. One thing we would like to highlight that is more positive than what I just said is over the last 3 years, Fremont Unified in collaboration with our employee groups have been able to give pretty substantial pay increases, and we've got those listed down here on the bottom, totaling almost 17.5% in ongoing salary increases, and then there was a 3.25% one-time payment back in 21-22. So we're very proud of this. Again, we want to compensate our employees, not only because we want to honor the job they're doing, we also want to keep them, we want to retain them so that they retire with us. And also we want to attract new employees who want to be here. We want this to continue to be a good place to work and learn and teach for students. This slide here, it's a lot of numbers, so I'll try to bottom line it for you. And luckily for us, we're right here at the bottom, second from the bottom. So what this is doing is the revenue per student comparison in the Alameda County. And so Fremont Unified is, per student, has about $13,300 in general fund revenues per student. And you can see how we compare to everyone else in our county. We're second to last in general fund revenue. We are last in local revenue, and I think we're fourth from the bottom in federal revenue. And so this just gives you an idea of what's going on in the rest of our county in comparables. There's other districts that we will compare ourselves to sometimes to get outside of our county, just to see how it looks in other places, districts from Contra Costa or even from Santa Clara County. But part of this is driven by our size, part of this is driven by the funding levels. This is just what we have. So it's good data to look at. We're constantly comparing because we want to make sure how things are going and how we're tracking versus all of the other people around us. One thing I wanted to mention before I turn this back over to Superintendent Kamick is I wanted to talk about something called the ending fund balance and reserves. So the ending fund balance is the amount of money that's left over in each fund after all of our revenues come in and we've paid all our expenses. So if you compare this to your own kind of personal finance or your own personal checking account, it's like having all of your expenses paid. You got money from a salary or from wherever, and if you have money left over, that's great. You get to hold on to that. You can use it on whatever you want. You can save it, you can spend it. The same thing works with ending fund balances. Every fund has an ending fund balance because every fund has expenses and has expenditures and revenues. Ending fund balances can be basically labeled a couple of different things. So you can have money sitting, we call it at the bottom line, basically at the bottom of the fund. It can be restricted, so sometimes the funds, we have them left over, but they can only be spent on certain things. So those are restricted ending fund balance. Other times, the ending fund balance dollars are committed, which is basically they've been earmarked by the board, local school board, for very specific things. And I've got an example of that in just a second. A common one would be, we're going to commit these dollars for a textbook adoption 2 and 3 years from now. So we want to hold on to it. We know it's there. We don't want to spend it. We're going to commit the funds. And it's a formal action that the board takes. Unassigned ending fund balance are funds that are available to cover any expense. They haven't been earmarked. They haven't been labeled anything. They're just sitting there, and no decision has been made. And then there's reserves. The reserves are the funds we have to set aside by state law. And so current state law for a district of our size, we're over 30,000 students, we have to hold 2% of our expenses in a reserve. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. And then our local board our board has made up a local rule to save an additional 1%. So all told, we're holding 3% in reserves, which is 3% of our expenses, our projected expenses. In Fremont Unified, as I mentioned earlier, we hold both reserves, the 2% and the 1%, in Fund 17. So it's set aside. You can't mistake it for anything else. It's labeled this right here, the Reserve for Economic Uncertainty. So I already mentioned the 30,000 students and the 2%. And as I mentioned, Fremont, we're holding an additional 1%. So we hold it in Fund 17. The reason we have it completely separate, and not every district does it this way, but I think it's a better way of doing it, is that if you hold your reserves in Fund 1 with everything else, and you have some things that are committed and some things that are not committed, and you have your reserve, the bottom line is going to say whatever it says, millions and millions of dollars, but how much of it can you truly talk about? How much of it can you truly spend or have a conversation if your reserves are in there? So there's always math that has to be done in order to explain to the public and to employee groups about, well, it says 30 million, but you really don't have 30 million because we had to pull out 17 for reserve. It just is confusing. So we put it into Fund 17. And in that way, whatever's at the bottom line in Fund 1, that's the amount to have a conversation about. This question comes up a lot, and I'm glad we put this in here, is how much of a reserve is 3%? It's about 4 to 6 weeks of payroll. So the reserve is not a lot when you think about the amount of expenses we have on a monthly or a quarterly basis. And the interesting thing is the state law says as soon as you use the reserve, you have to put it right back by the next quarterly report. So basically the reserve is there. We're meeting state law. We're not planning to use it anytime soon. No district really ever does unless they need it for like a cash flow issue that's very short term because they've got to put it back right away. So it's there. It's really a safety net, but it's a safety net that doesn't last very long. So the current and new fund balance in our Fund 1, these are the commitments that we have. We've set aside $3 million for emergency supplies. There are some things that need to be refreshed and rebought. We also have our local patrol accountability plan carryover money from last year. You're allowed to carry it over if you have a plan. And we have about 2.9 million of those funds, so they've been committed. We have a need to replace some of our aging transportation vehicles. We've set aside $4 million to do that over the next couple of years. Textbook adoption, as I mentioned earlier, is a good example, and we have about $6 million set aside. Again, a multi-year textbook adoption. This isn't to be spent in 1 year. And then in the assignment section, we've got schools facility use funds, about $200,000 there. These are the fees that are collected when users, community users, use our schools. We give those back to our school sites. Medi-Cal allocation, about $540,000. We have set aside $8.4 million in technology refresh for devices for staff and students, again, multiple years. And then deficit spending. We have a title called deficit spending. Let me explain what this is. So earlier when I gave the example of you have all your revenues and you have all your expenses, and then you have leftover, you have an ending fund balance. Well, if you don't have that, and you have more expenses than you have revenues, you're deficit spending. You're spending too much. And in your personal finances, I think everybody knows what that would feel like. Well, Fremont Unified does have that situation right now. We are spending more than we are currently bringing in revenue, and we know this, and we're planning for it in the following way. We basically, to have our current level of service, we know how much it costs us. And so what we've done in this line item here called deficit spending is we've set aside the money we need for the next couple of years to maintain our current level of service without having to make any adjustments to our expenditures. We don't have to change our level of service right now, but we're going to have to do something in a couple of years because when this deficit spending line item goes to zero, we won't be able to fund the current services that we have. So one of two things has to happen. We need to adjust our expenditures or we need to find new revenues. So that's how we have the ending fund balance set up. And one other thing I'll say about this, and then we'll go to the next slide, is all of these dollars are one time. What I mean by that is once they're spent, they're gone because they're sitting at the bottom line. It's like your personal checking account or savings account. It doesn't get replenished by your salary because your salary is covering your expenses, your reoccurring monthly expenses. So when you set these things aside, we try to earmark them for good financial planning and good communication. But at the end of the day, we're going to need textbook adoption for the next decade or more. And so we then have to make a decision in the future to put more money into this line item so that we can continually make sure we have, in this case, the right version of textbooks as an example. So this is something that we constantly look at. It's something we constantly adjust. And we formally adjust our budget 3 to 4 times a year and bring that back to the board for their review and for their action. So, okay, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Superintendent Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Hillman. So if that was the context in which we existed, we might be okay, but there's a number of challenges that we face that really impact not only Fremont Unified, but districts across the state. Before I begin to go into some of the specific challenges, I want to take us back to this slide. And I think it's important to note, as Mr. Hillman pointed out, where we are second from the bottom in the entire county. But you may be asking yourself, why is that? And so there's a couple reasons, but the main reason behind that is the design of the local control funding formula. So you'll notice some of the districts on the top, they likely have a higher unduplicated percentage than we do, and or you'll see in other local revenue, they have a significant amount of local revenue that is being provided from within their community. And so you will see that some of the more affluent districts that don't have significant local revenue coming in, when you combine that with LCFF, the per student allocation of general fund dollars from the state varies greatly. And as Mr. Hillman pointed out, the intent behind LCFF is great in that the state is saying for our students who might have more intense needs, they're going to allocate more dollars to meet those needs. But you do see on this slide some of the challenges that are created with the local funding formula. Moving to some of our more formalized challenges, we talked earlier about how funding is based on enrollment. And then you get your funding based on a percentage of your enrollment that comes to school regularly, our average daily attendance. Well, what we're seeing across the state is a decline in birth rates. And why does that matter? Well, that means that we have less kids that will be entering our school system. So we work with demographers. We look at our birth rates and then plan out 4.5 years now with transitional kindergarten when we might expect to see students enrolling in Fremont Unified. And with the decline in birth rates, we see a decline in the overall student population, not only in Fremont, but across the state of California. On the right side of this slide, you'll also see a representation of enrollment trends across the state. And so that is in part due to declining enrollment. It's also due in part to the fact that for the first time in many years, the last few years, the state has actually decreased in population. People have been moving out of California. So those two things combined start to impact districts negatively because declining enrollment means a decline in your revenue. When we talk about our enrollment locally, we plan for a more significant decline in enrollment this year because that was the trend that we were seeing. We're very happy to see our enrollment this year come much closer to what we would call flat enrollment. We're actually down about 51 students this year compared to last year, which is much better than we've done year over year the last 3 to 5 years. We did see an increase in our elementary school enrollment, and we think that that is in part due to the extended day kindergarten program that we've been able to implement in collaboration with our partners at FUTA, and we think that's designed a more desirable place for students early in their academic career. And we're very pleased to see these results. We hope that they'll continue year over year. Another key factor that Mr. Hillman mentioned that's a challenge is the pension rates. And I want to be clear that all employees in the school district, whether they're classified or certificated, are part of the CalPERS or CalSTRS pension program, myself included. Most workers pay into Social Security in the private sector, but in the public school system sector, it's either CalPERS, which is generally our classified employees, or CalSTRS, which is our credentialed or certificated employees. So way back when I was a 5th grade teacher, and I still had a little bit of hair, the percent of my paycheck that went towards my pension was 8.25%. And my employer at that time, Mount Diablo Unified, matched that amount at 8.25%. Well, there's unfunded liabilities within the pension program at the state level. And Fremont Unified has no influence over that outcome. So what happens is contributions have changed significantly, and we'll show you what that means on this slide. Not only have employers' rates gone up for what they need to contribute, employee rates have gone up too, which means they're contributing more out of their paycheck towards their pension. And it's a reasonable line of thinking to say, well, employees, myself included, are paying into a pension system that they will then see when they retire. However, I have an issue with what's happening at the state level. And that is, I believe that the state has put the unfunded liability on the backs of school districts and, for that matter, students. So what you see in this graph is in about 2013, the state passed new laws because that is how the CalSTRS rates are set. They're set by the legislature. Fremont Unified has no governance or control over that outcome. The CalPERS rates are set by a board at the state level, which is half elected and half appointed. Again, Fremont Unified has no control over that outcome. And you can see on this graph, as you move to your right-hand side of the graph, the percentage increase that employers are making towards the pension contribution. And we want to make that contribution because we want all of our employees, when they retire, to enjoy the pension program that they have worked hard to have as one of the rewards for their dedication in their career. What does all this mean for us locally in terms of actual dollars? So you see on this chart from 2016 to 22-23 what the difference means in actual dollars. So in 2016, our contribution for pensions in Fremont Unified was about $31.6 million. Last year it was up to $80 million. And I know this is going to come as a giant surprise for our massive audience and for those who may be watching the live stream. The state of California doesn't send school districts an additional pot of money to make this payment. So school districts, since the law was changed in 2013-14, have had to take the new ongoing revenue that they receive and automatically take chunks of it away to ensure that they can pay the pension obligations that have increased year over year as what I would call an underfunded or unfunded mandate by the state of California. And so you ask yourself, or at least I ask myself, what could Fremont Unified do with that additional, let's just say $50 million year over year? Well, we could design a lot of programs for kids. We could do a lot to honor the work of our employees for recruitment and retention. And we could do a lot to address facility needs as well. This is a significant challenge for us, and as the slide says, I truly believe that it is passing the buck. I do think our pension systems need to be funded properly for our employees across the state, but I think the burden that has been placed on school districts, absent a specific fund to help address that, is unfair. The other place where I think we have an underfunded or unfunded mandate is in special education, and this is something that is near and dear to my heart for personal reasons. But if you're familiar with the federal law, IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA was a law passed at the federal level. When they passed that law, it was accompanied with a promise at the federal level that the federal government would pay for 40% of the expenses of special education. I'm in my 20 plus years of service to public education, and I have never seen that percentage over 15%. And on the slide in front of you, you can begin to see the impact that that has on a school district. Now, I want to be clear, our special education students rightfully deserve the programs and services which we can provide for them, and we want to continue doing that. However, the federal government's, frankly, absence in the funding of this model significantly impacts how districts allocate resources. So on the slide you can see, just in 22-23, for example, our total $95 million. The federal government was responsible for just under 9% of that at 8.7. We're grateful that the state of California steps in and provides about 35.5%. But as Mr. Hillman talked about our general fund, where we have most of our operational costs, and we do get restricted money for special education. However, in order to provide the services and programs that our students rightfully deserve, we make a contribution from our general fund to support special education in the amount of almost $53 million. And you could imagine, by doing some rough estimates, if the federal government started to fund the 40% that they have promised, the amount of additional revenue that would be available for school districts to use on student programs, honoring the hard work of teachers, facilities needs. And when you take this slide and the last issue with pensions, you can start to imagine the magnitude of what would happen for school districts if we weren't burdened with some of these unfunded or underfunded mandates. So when we are burdened with those unfunded mandates, one of the areas where we are grateful for the support that we receive in Fremont Unified is local support. And the reason I refer to this as protected funding with a promise is because when we pass a local measure in Fremont, like Measure I or Measure E, our parcel tax and our general obligation bond, the state can't come in and mess with that money or change the allocation of that money. And we make a promise to the voters in the ballot initiative that we put in front of the voters how we're going to spend those dollars. And that local contribution and support is critically important to school districts, especially in Fremont Unified. So I'm often asked, what can we do to help with funding for the school district? Well, I think there's two key things that you can do. The first, advocate with your local officials, your elected officials at the state level, and your local elected officials at the federal level, and share with them that schools in California and across the nation need more specific funding for the state of California, and the federal government needs to meet their promise of 40% under IDEA. But that local support is critically important, and you can see what some districts have in terms of local support in this sample. This is the tax rates for bond measures. So again, general obligation bond passed by the voters, and this is based on the assessed valuation of your property per $100,000. So you can see where Fremont Unified falls per $100,000 of assessed valuation. And you can see on the graph the representation that other districts have in terms of local support for bond tax rates. That may be because they have multiple bonds that exist at the same time that are stacked on top of each other. But in terms of our bond tax rate for our community, we're happy for our community members that it's relatively low, and we appreciate the support of our community members to provide funding under Measure E that helps us address facilities needs. As Mr. Hillman mentioned, there's not an additional pot of money that comes from the state or the federal government that comes to us each year just for facilities. And as Mr. Hillman mentioned, there are times where the state may pass a bond, but that goes across districts throughout the state and is often allocated based on a needs analysis, or sometimes based on the size of the district. And even as the 23rd largest district in the state, when you start talking about a district the size of LA Unified that has 600,000 students, that division of those dollars happens very quickly. So as I mentioned earlier, Measure I provides about $4.5 million of revenue for Fremont Unified. And you can see on the screen the things that it helps support and maintain for our students, for our schools, and for our staff. So Measure I is set to expire in June of 2025. And we are currently exploring the opportunity for a future ballot measure for a parcel tax, because when a parcel tax expires locally, we obviously have an area in the budget and needs and services that we provide to students that we'd like to continue providing thanks to the generosity of our community. The other local measure that we have, as I mentioned, is Measure E, which was a $650 million general obligation bond. And so while Measure I expires in June of 2025, we just sold our last series of Measure E bonds in 2022. The reason we sell them in series is because the school district can only have a certain amount of revenue from bond proceeds on hand at a given time. You need to have a balance of the amount of revenue you have on hand from bond proceeds to the amount that you have allocated for construction projects. And if you are out of balance with that, you can be in trouble. So we sell our bonds in series. The last series we sold was $120 million. And we're proud of the fact that we have good credit rating as a district. We have a AA2 credit rating. That makes our bonds attractive when they go to market. The other thing that we've done that I think is helpful for our community and just good business sense is, as you might with your home, if you are paying your mortgage and you see that the interest rates have gone down, you might consider refinancing that mortgage for a lower interest rate. Well, we work with financial advisors, and when they advise us that the interest rates have gone down and we have an opportunity to refinance our bonds, we do that as well. And when we do that, we're saving the taxpayers millions of dollars in what we repay in total towards the bond. You can see some of the projects on the slide. It does not encompass anywhere near the total scope of projects that have been completed. And we know that a bulk of Measure E has gone to the conversion of our junior highs to middle schools. So as I mentioned earlier, we have current needs and future growth. So when we passed Measure E, we had a long-range facilities plan from 2014 that estimated a total of $1.6 billion of projects in need. And the $650 million bond is incredibly helpful, but it doesn't address the full set of needs from a facility standpoint across the district. Right now, we're currently updating our long-range facilities plan. We're reviewing the previously identified projects and the new needs at each school site that have come up in that time period. And as I mentioned earlier, in the exploration of a potential future parcel tax, we've also engaged in community outreach and polling on a potential future bond measure to help address facilities needs within the district, which would be dependent on the support of our community. And so I think that begins to show a little bit of the context and how it weaves together the financial picture for Fremont Unified, where the LCFF model doesn't necessarily create the best outcome for Fremont Unified as a district based on conditions beyond our control, and where we have unfunded and underfunded mandates at the state level, which I believe dramatically impact school districts across the state, but also us locally in Fremont Unified, in terms of what we can do with our revenue and how flexible it then becomes. In closing for tonight, we do have a few audience members. I'd be happy to take some questions. For those who are watching on the live stream or in the audience, I would encourage you to take out your phone, capture the QR code, and we'll take you to what we call a thought exchange. And that is an opportunity for you as audience members, either in person or streaming, to give us feedback about your perspectives on school finance in Fremont Unified and what you think would be important feedback. This tool allows us to hear from our community, and what you will do is you'll provide a response to a prompt. When you provide that response, it doesn't show your name, but other people who also provide responses get to see your response and those of others. And as they review those responses, or as you review those responses, you can rate those responses with stars. And what starts to happen is the trends start to emerge from the feedback about what's important to our community or our staff members that are providing us that feedback. So I would encourage you to engage in this process with us if you are willing. You don't have to, but we would certainly like the feedback. With that, I'm happy to answer questions the best I can from any of our audience members. I apologize to those that are streaming. We're not taking live questions via the stream. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
I have lots of questions. So I really appreciate your meeting us today, as well as the Washington High School meeting. I feel your pain about the $10,570 that we're limited to. How does that get changed? Because I think that the notion in 2013 that we had, that we will always have people coming to California, that we'll always have kids going to school, is no longer the case. I mean, the pandemic showed that just missing 10 days of school, the city loses funding. That's ridiculous. That attendance can no longer be tied to the money that the city receives. So what is being done in order for that to change?
Great question. So I'm going to repeat it and rephrase it a little bit so that our streaming audience can hear it as well. The question was, for our base funding that we receive under the LCFF per student, how do we increase that? And so I think there's a couple different things that we need to consider. The first is advocacy at the state level. And as Mr. Hillman mentioned, under Prop 98, we're getting roughly 40% of the state budget, which to me isn't enough. But if you look at allocations of the state budget across California, it's a huge share relative to what other parts of the state receive. So it is a difficult ask when we go to our legislators and we say, we need more money, because the pie for them is only so big and they need to reallocate that pie. Nonetheless, I believe in the work that we're doing, and I believe that the pie needs to increase for public education. So step one is advocating at the state level to say, we need more funding for school districts, and it needs to be ongoing. What we oftentimes see is one-time dollars when there's extra, which are helpful, but they're not sustainable. And so what we refer to it as is that base grant needs to rise, and it needs to rise at a level that puts us really at the top of the nation in school funding. We've been close to the nation, the bottom of the nation for a long time. We've made some progress in recent years. The other component with local control funding formula that I would say is, in its inception, I think it had great intent. And the idea was that we would send the money from the state to school districts, and within school districts, we have things like the LCAP, where we would build a local plan, right? Because locally, we should know what's best. I think we do know what's best locally. But the example I give is a little long-winded, but it's like this. If we were going to load up a bus of friends and family and start at the very top of Northern California and came up with a list of all the places we'd like to go see on our way to the very end of Southern California, what are all the great places we'd like to go see? What are all the great things we'd like to do? And we'll come up with an incredible plan to do that. And then you have the realization that your funding is only going to allow you to go in a straight line down I-5 without exiting, except for gas, from north to south. And so the exceptional plans that you can build locally because you know what's best for your students in your community get constricted significantly by the lack of revenue that we receive and impacted by the underfunded or unfunded mandates. So really, I think the biggest thing we can do is advocate at the state level and at the federal level to say the size of the pie has to increase.
The equation is no longer accurate, right? So it's not enough to just say, as a person or a community to say, hey, I don't think this funding is appropriate. An equivalent equation needs to be given. I don't think that attendance makes sense as a portion to determine whether a school gets the funding dollars, given wildfires and pandemics and the general state of the world, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think that so what is the city itself doing? Like, as you begin your conversations, continue your conversations with our local and state representatives, what are you doing? And then the other question I have along with that is, do you foresee cuts to teacher and libraries in this 2023 in the next 2 years?
Okay. Let me try and address those. The two questions were, does the actual funding model work in terms of receiving funding based on average daily attendance, and how do we change that? And then do we foresee cuts this year? So I'm going to start with the attendance piece. You also asked what we're doing at the city level. I just want to clarify, the city of Fremont, while we appreciate their partnership, has no governance over Fremont Unified. We're separate entities as a whole. So our local elected officials on the city council and our local mayor, while we appreciate their involvement and collaboration, they really don't have any mechanical structure in which they can influence the funding for us as a school district. So that's why we say we need to go to our state officials. And that takes me to the question about attendance and how we're funded. We design everything in our schools based on our total enrollment, not our average daily attendance. When teachers are preparing their lessons, if they have 30 students in their class, they're not preparing for 27 on the guess that 3 might be absent. Everything's prepared for 30. And as a 5th grade teacher myself, I always prepared for 33 because I knew some kids would lose something. But the model for that funding at the state level, we have talked with state legislature about, and this goes back to needing a bigger pie. Because if they take the size of the pie that we have now for revenue in the state that's allocated to public school districts, and they fund it based on enrollment, then some districts are going to lose money. So what we need, if we want to go to an enrollment-based funding model, which I think would be beneficial, because it's not as reliant on the daily attendance, we need, again, more money in the total pie for public schools in the state of California. And part of the reason I think some people are hesitant, and this is just my perception at the state level, is because the average daily attendance helps ensure that districts are motivated to ensure students are coming to school regularly, because attendance has a huge impact on learning. That being said, I think districts that are doing business the right way for kids, with kids at the center of their decision making, whether we switch to an enrollment model of funding or an attendance model of funding, we're going to make sure our kids are coming to school because we just know it's right for kids. But that's one of the things that is discussed at the state, and it goes back to a bigger pie. I'm going to take a question here.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So I want to know about, I know that you said there's 3% that needs to be saved in the reserves. My understanding is that in September, the unaudited actuals that came out, Fremont Unified had something around $111 million. So that's well beyond the 3% that's required. I'm wondering what that potentially could have been spent on. As a teacher here in the district, we didn't get the cost of living adjustment for this year. We took 1% less than the cost of living, which the district did receive. Yeah, so what exactly is the reserve that we have?
Good question. So for our streaming audience, the question is, when we had our unaudited actuals, which is when we close our books and we then go through the calculation of what our projected spending and revenue was versus our actual spending and revenue, we had a variance in that number and a larger ending fund balance than normal. So the question was, where could that money have gone to, or where should it have gone to, if I might rephrase it? And it's a great question. One thing I want to point out, as Mr. Hillman mentioned, is that ending fund reserve is a one-time dollar. So part of the question was, employees received less than the full COLA that was provided by the state. So let's just consider that if that money was allocated for salary increases, the amount that is remaining in the ending fund balance this year is a one-time amount, so it wouldn't be able to sustain an ongoing pay increase. So if the settlement for the agreement for salary increases was higher, from an ongoing revenue perspective, we would have been in trouble because the ending fund balance is one time. The creation of our ending fund balance, or the cause of our ending fund balance, was really driven by two things. Some of the one-time funding that we're still carrying over, and we had budgeted for additional staffing that we weren't able to fill and that we didn't use. And when we have that staffing in the budget, we set that money aside to fill those positions. When they weren't used, that money, as Mr. Hillman pointed out, falls to the bottom line. A key area of that was special education positions. Those were the two largest contributing factors. And in a perfect world, the money allocated for that would have gone to that staff, could we have hired and filled those positions. And then the one-time monies will get allocated and used in future years. As Mr. Hillman pointed out, we've set some designations up for those ending fund balances to try and best utilize the one-time dollars on things that will have an extended lifespan. For example, curriculum adoptions, emergency supplies, technology refreshes.
Lowering class size?
Lowering class size is something to consider. I would say, in addition to that consideration, you'd have to recognize that that would only happen for a specific period of time before that one-time money goes out. So there are some complications with that, because to lower class size, we would hire more staff, which would be great. And when that one-time money runs out in a short amount of time, then we go into a position of layoffs. And those can be very difficult. So there is a lot to consider. And I still recall my days as a fifth grade teacher, where every year I taught fifth grade at Mount Diablo. I had 36 students in my class. So I do empathize and understand with that. I just think that we have to be mindful that in the ending fund balance, we're really talking about one-time dollars. So when we attach the one-time dollars, whether it's to salary or to personnel, we have to know that the ability to pay that salary or to staff that personnel goes away in a very short amount of time, as that one-time expense takes away the one-time revenue. But thank you for the question. So we'll take one more question, and I know we have you past where we are right now. Go ahead.
So do you anticipate any layoffs or cutting of library or teachers this year or the next year?
Thank you for asking that. I did not get to that in my last response, so thank you for reminding me to come back to that. We do not anticipate making reductions this year. Our budget, as it's currently crafted, which is based on projections that we have from the state level, does not necessarily project significant reductions next year either. I do want to caution that there's two things that will significantly impact that. One is the enrollment that we end up seeing next year. The other is, in January, we see the governor's budget proposal for the year. And so when we start to see the governor's budget proposal in January, we'll have more solid information to make our projections for the out years of our budget. As Mr. Hillman mentioned, with some of our ending fund balance, we've set aside money to address the deficit spending that's happening in the district. If we didn't set that money aside, we'd have to make some reductions. But we have set money aside for the next few years to deal with the deficit spending that we have. And if we can continue to maintain the projected revenue at the state level, then I don't anticipate reductions this year or next year. One thing that I would also say that is unique about our projections is with the storms that we had last year, the state of California provided every county in the state, except for I think one county, the ability to file their taxes late. And so instead of having to file by April 15th, you actually had an extension to October. And so the state is just now getting the true picture of that revenue. And we saw earlier in the presentation where Mr. Hillman shared how much that personal income tax impacts the state revenue. So we're watching to see what the developments are at the state level for that income tax. And the UCLA forecast, which we watch closely, and the Legislative Analyst's Office, which we watch closely, kind of shares that our revenues are coming in at the state level close to where they anticipated, not significantly below and not significantly higher. So I don't anticipate cuts this year. I don't anticipate cuts next year given our current projections, but those variables can change. So with that, it's about 7:15. I want to thank those who came in person and those who watched online. And again, thank the staff who helped put this together. Have a wonderful night.